allow us to take you to 1981 today, a year where Ric Flair won his first championship. Woo! MTV aired its first music video, and I wasn't born yet. In line with 1981 being a year of firsts, the game Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, was released, the first computer game based on D&D rule sets. The remake of this legendary role-playing game sees you managing a party and delving deep into a mystical maze. But is this maze one you want to see through to the finish, or does it end up hitting a dead end? Let's find out in our full review. But hey, don't you get lost in a maze of lackluster gaming coverage. Consider joining our Patreon, where you'll gain Discord access to the greatest indie gaming community, early ad-free shows, shoutouts at the end of every video we make, exclusive podcasts, and even free games depending on your tier. At patreon.com/idreamofindiegames, your new indie gaming community is waiting for you. As mentioned, 1981 saw the release of Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, an RPG following a D&D rule set combined with dungeon crawling elements and environmental puzzles played from a first-person perspective. The game was a success, leading to a trilogy series and numerous spin-offs, while influencing many modern CRPGs and first-person dungeon crawlers. In keeping with the original, this newly launched version of the game attempts to take us back to a more classic role-playing style. This remake, while keeping the same name as the original, also retains the original premise. A wizard named Werdna steals an amulet from Trebor, the Mad Overlord. Werdna then goes on to create a 10-level maze underneath Trebor's castle. Trebor then tasks new adventurers with delving deep into this maze in hopes of killing Werdna once and for all. Unfortunately for you, this is easier said than done. That's essentially all the story we get. Certain plot points are revealed when we uncover secrets or enter a new level of the maze, but the game is rather light on story. Personally, it kind of felt like the developers missed an opportunity to extend upon the Wizardry lore. On the topic of the maze though, get used to being caught up in it because it's an area that you'll be passing through quite often. You begin the game by choosing between modern or original gameplay options, which essentially act as difficulty levels. I chose modern, but you can freely switch between modern, original, and custom options as well. From here, you enter a small hub area where you'll be able to choose between various buildings: the training grounds, an inn, a tavern, a temple, a store, and at the center of town is the maze. This hub is a graphical representation of the basic text menu the original release used. Fun fact, apparently this remake was built with the original game's source code intact, which is admirable in its own way. Players will create characters at the training grounds. You can choose between fighters, thieves, mages, bishops, priests, and even ninjas or samurais eventually. Various races can be chosen as well: human, elf, dwarf, halfling, and gnome. You'll have the freedom to distribute skills from a set number of skill points, eventually unlocking new classes that can be assigned. I liked playing around with having powerful tank fighters right at the beginning, and found this approach a fun way to start filling out my squad. Other than that, you can name and choose a portrait for the character along with their alignment of either good, neutral, or evil. Good and evil characters cannot be partied up together. This is where the lack of lore becomes even more apparent. It would have been nice to have a better understanding as to why certain characters were feuding, but we don't get that sadly. Something that struck me as a bit odd was that after creating a character, you have to go straight to the tavern to add them to your party. I would have preferred being able to add them directly from the training grounds. But regardless, going back to the tavern, this is where you'll recruit new party members should your entire party be wiped out, unless you choose to start over again with level 1 characters. Recruitable characters will start at the highest level you obtained for their respective class. These recruits can be pricey though, and I rarely found myself with enough money to actually recruit them. After forming a party, we are introduced to the main gameplay loop involving the maze. Players will explore the labyrinth from the first-person perspective, taking steps on a grid. The gameplay feels somewhere in between a dungeon crawler, a la Dungeon Master or Grimrock, and a non-randomized roguelike structure with CRPG rule sets. The turn-based combat is mostly random, with a few scripted encounters. Interesting to note, unlike other RPGs, you don't choose which enemy to apply an attack to. Instead, you choose the type of attack, and your party members will strike targets on their own. Party positioning is rather important if you hope to succeed in battle. While you won't be moving characters around on the battlefield at free will, you are able to position them. Those in the front row can use melee attacks, while characters in the back row will use abilities such as spells or hiding. Speaking of spells, you have a limited number of spell points. It took me some time to realize that spell points are determined by the number of spells you have. If a character only has 2 spells, then they only have 2 spell points. This isn't explained to you all that well, and in general, a lot of the gameplay mechanics aren't explained in detail as there's no real tutorial. The first 2 floors of the maze are instead intended to be easier in order to gain experience and help players come to grips with the core gameplay loop. Enemy encounters will take you to a first-person battle screen similar to many classic RPGs such as Dragon's Quest. There are times where you have no information about the enemies you're battling, but thankfully, investigating foes by using party members of high intellect makes this less of an issue. Learning more about enemies will teach you their names, strengths, weaknesses, and attacks. This is all recorded by the game as well, and you also have enemy cards that can be brought up in battle. All actions are dependent on a dice roll, which often led to missing or failing. That could be pretty frustrating. For good aligned parties, some encounters will be with friendly monsters, which means you don't have to fight them at all. This was the only time I found alignment really mattered in the game. Side note, something I found funny was orcs tend to run away often, and the image of a big brutish scary orc running away from a level 1 mage with 3 health is kinda silly. Either way, the majority of these encounters are nice and snappy, which makes them feel fun and impactful each time, though they don't always mesh perfectly with the rest of the gameplay loop. Unsurprisingly, you'll gain experience, gold, and treasure from defeating enemies. When your characters are able to level up, you'll have to leave the maze and head to the inn. At the inn, you can rest your party to regain health and spell points. You can also level up characters individually and apply new skill points. With gold, you'll want to head to the store and buy new equipment. Equipment and consumables are very pricey, so yeah, expect the game to lean heavily on resource and party management. Back in the maze, you can choose to camp should you find yourself in a safe space. When camping, you can use healing spells, consumables, or equipped items. You can also choose to exit the maze, however, this leaves your party behind, so you won't be able to leave the maze from just anywhere. Instead, you have to take your party with you and leave the maze the way you came in. Personally, I found no use in leaving the maze without my party, and that is more or less the core gameplay loop of Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. Go back and forth exploring the maze, gain loot and experience, and exit the maze to level up and purchase materials. While you will eventually discover teleportation, expect to be exploring the same corridors often in the early going, making this a very, very grindy experience. And what a maze this is! It's designed in a way to confuse you no matter how many times you run through the same corridors. You'll often find yourself stuck in looping doors and can't figure out the puzzle necessary to get through, or you'll find a secret door and open up a new area, only to become lost soon after. It doesn't help that many of the hallways are exceedingly dark. If it wasn't obvious, Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord is very difficult. The game can theoretically take hundreds of hours to complete. That said, more seasoned players who really know the ins and outs of its intricate web can theoretically beat it in a few hours. It is a game that requires taking time to learn all of the mechanics and enemies, and that can often feel like work. Sometimes you'll have easy encounters, sure, but other times you'll come across 10 enemies at a time. This gets frustrating as your party dies down and you keep failing attack and escape rolls. Truth be told, dying, not having enough gold to buy new recruits, and having to start over with level 1 characters just gets tedious. At the least, you can resurrect fallen party members at the town's temple for free if you successfully bring them back to town. But if the whole party is annihilated, then there will be a hefty price to pay. Not only that, you'll have to once again venture into the maze with a new party and recover your fallen friends, which could lead to your new party dying in the process, which mine did quite often. The temple can resurrect characters, but a roll is required. If you fail one roll, the character will be reduced to ashes. If you fail a second roll, after this, the character's just gone forever. So yeah, players should expect a lot of RNG, backtracking, management, and tedious exploration. Your reward? Reaching the 3rd floor of the maze, where the difficulty really ramps up. Ominously, you are greeted with a message on this floor telling you to turn back. If you think you're underpowered, I say it's best to heed this warning. Progress is slow, and the gameplay loop feels dated, as if to artificially increase game length, though fans of the original release and other classic RPGs may feel a bit more comfortable with this. For me, however, it just didn't click, and I found myself either becoming disengaged or frustrated when my more successful builds ended up failing. I felt as if I never had the chance to get a solid grip on the mechanics. As an example, during one of my runs I found a bronze key, but I only found a silver door, so I tried to find the correct door for this key and ended up coming across 5 Vorpal bunnies, which much as a death sentence when you're under-leveled. Luckily, you keep your keys on death, so I didn't have to find the key again and could try to make it to the bronze door eventually, but you get the point. Performance-wise, the game runs well, and I didn't experience any bugs or crashes that are worth mentioning. Running Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, shouldn't be an issue on most PCs, and consoles are unlikely to experience any issues either given the lightweight of the game itself. Visually, the game resembles more of a dungeon crawler than a typical CRPG at first glance anyways. You walk down tight corridors in the dark through first person, and it all looks kinda nice. However, the environments don't change very much, and the maze's look becomes stale after a few hours of exploring it. It makes sense from a gameplay perspective since it is a maze and you're supposed to get lost, but I feel similar games have had success creating mazes with more varied environments. Battle scenes are also nothing to write home about. There are some differences to the look of the encounters depending on which floor you're on, but nothing ever stood out. At the least, battles do feature some decent visual effects to make things a bit more interesting looking. Something that I do think is neat on the right-hand side of the screen, there's this little wireframe interpretation of the maze, and that's what the display looked like for the original PC release back in 1981. On the left, you have your auto map, which is filled out as you move, similar to how players of the original would draw their own map since the game originally had no auto map. By the way, if using the original settings, this auto map is no longer displayed at all. You can also fill this map out using a spell your characters can get from leveling. The enemy designs are decent, if not a bit generic. Some enemies are just palette swaps of each other, but shout out to the Gas Cloud, he was rather fun and colorful. You can view the character models in full detail, which is a nice addition to the game. The town screen is pretty good looking and well drawn, along with all of the character portraits. The art reminds me of something you'd see in a fantasy storybook, which could be thought of as a throwback to tabletop D&D modules. Overall, the visuals are a bit of a mixed bag, but not half bad. Thankfully, music is one of my favorite aspects of the game. Everything sounds so epic and well produced. The in-music is restful, the victory music is grand, and it makes you feel powerful, and the theme that plays upon death is doom-like and taunting. The start menu music was also lovely and made me feel ready for an adventure. However, music alone can't save this game for me, though I wish it could. I'm a fan of RPGs, both of the video game and tabletop variety, as well as fantasy in general. I've only ever heard of Wizardry and seen gameplay clips before taking on this review, so I was eager to try out this granddaddy of the genre, but it didn't end up clicking with me. I found the gameplay to be too dated and grindy for my liking, and the presentation, while admittedly a big step up from the wireframe days of old, was just too generic to keep me engaged. I believe a more casual gaming audience will find the brutal difficulty off-putting and too RNG heavy, which makes things feel unfair. I can fully admit when I lack skill for a game, but that just didn't feel like the case here. Combined with a lack of lore and dialogue, this version of Wizardry ends up feeling old and flat. I will say I appreciate the dedication the devs had in keeping faithful to the original design. I believe those who played the original and serious fans of RPGs might be interested in this. However, I'm not sure if they need to buy the remake in order to get the experience the original Wizardry already provides. As such, I can't really recommend this game unless you're a fan of Wizardry already, or have a strong passion for super difficult dungeon crawling RPGs.
Uh-oh.